We are thrilled today to welcome to CITP David Lazer, is University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Computer Sciences at Northeastern University, co-director of the Northeastern University Lab for Digital Humanities and Computational Social Science. He's going to talk with us about this fantastic new initiative called the National Internet Observatory. David is an elected fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. Don't read his CV because it will make you feel really, really bad about yourself. And so I think that's the most salient thing for today. So David, the floor is yours. We have about an hour. Would you like people to interrupt with questions as you go? Or
just interrupt as we go if you have questions.
Awesome.
And if I say something annoying, you can just throw pieces of paper at me or something. So, and I just want to say it's sort of particularly nice for me to come here because this was actually my first academic job was at Princeton. So as a lecturer, so not a glorified position. I did everything but sweep the floors. But this is actually the first formal talk actually I think I've given at Princeton, and the last time I gave a talk was as a practice job talk before I went to the Kennedy School, so like 20-something years ago. So pretty remarkable. But it's really special to be back here. So I'm going to begin with before I get to the main thing I'm talking about. I actually want to begin with a small digression. There's a way in which actually the talk is in a sense around solving a collective action issue, which is how do we collect data and how do we think about solving that for the field rather than just solving it one researcher at a time. But we also face another, I think, bigger collective action problem today, which is the existential crisis facing academia. I think I'm just going to start every talk I give for, the rest of, maybe it's the rest of my career, maybe that won't be that long, with a 2-minute plea for how do we collectively organize across universities. And I hope if I say this enough, that it will spark some creative thinking along these lines. And there's a wonderful classic quote by one of the great 20th century political scientists, E. Schaffsnyder, that says every fight has two parts: the few individuals who are actively engaged at the center, and the audience that is irresistibly attracted to the scene. The spectators are an integral part of the situation, for as likely as not, the audience determines the outcome of the fight. And there's a way in which the structure of the battle in academia right now is in part like institution by institution. You go from being in the fight or being a spectator to being in the fight. And we need to think, how do we bring that audience into the fight? And in particular, there's a sort of broader societal element to this, and a lot of assets that higher education have not brought to bear. And so part of the question is, how do we work together across institutions? I was talking to someone at Harvard, which is now like the next up, and I was talking to a dean there back in mid-November, and Harvard already had like something like 25 committees looking at avenues of attack on the institution, but in none of them did involve talking to other institutions, as far as I could tell. It was all, what will Harvard do? And at the end of the day, Harvard is a huge institution and a rich institution, but very small relative to its opponent, and will inevitably lose if it's just Harvard versus the federal government. And so the things that we need to think about, what higher education needs to do, is in part thinking about how to coordinate across institutions. And some of that's information sharing. There are a lot of lawyers at Harvard, but not enough, right? There should be a fight of every university against the federal government in terms of what's happening. If it's one at a time, we lose. If it's all, there's a basis for potentially at least not losing as much. We should pool resources, whether it's around legal resources, figuring out communication strategies, lobbying. We should mobilize the crowd. There's an enormous, and we can talk a lot about the populist moment, but there are 100 million alumni college, give or take, in this country. And if every institution was reaching out and documenting how adversely they were going to be affected, those alumni, and universities have done a lot, no institution more than Princeton, to cultivate alumni. But frankly, it's been often viewing alumni as piggy banks. And it's not about money right now. It is literally getting people chanting their fight songs in front of congressional offices, right? I mean, that is what the moment needs. We need that kind of massive mobilization, and actually higher education has created the assets to facilitate that kind of massive mobilization through the cultivation of alumni. Just no institution is doing it yet. And that is a failure. And I think the final thought, and then I'll move on to the main thing, is that we either fight now or we lose, because no one will spring to the defense of institutions that have debased themselves, right? That have conceded on principle, because at that point, you've given up the game. And it's not like that's the end. It's not like there's sort of like, yes, if you just betray your core principles, we're not going to take money away. We're not going to take student visas away. We're not going to stop picking up students off of the street. I mean, my God, there was a student picked up, the tough student, it was just 3 miles from my home, right? That we need to figure out how we protect our students, how we protect ourselves. And so I just want to help catalyze that conversation. So with that, I want to shift gears to a different collective action problem. And I'm happy to talk about this one as well, both here and subsequently. So today, what I've been devoting the last several years of my career to is building the National Internet Observatory. And I want to begin with discuss why this is necessary, and sort of a bit of history here, just personal history. This is sort of funny. I wrote a paper. Back in 2007, I held a conference titled Computational Social Science. Then yielded a paper titled that has gotten some degree of notoriety in terms of the field. And I would talk about doing study on digital trace data and how this was going to change everything in terms of studying human behavior. And every time I gave that talk in 07, 08, 09, 10, I would have people say, that is so amazing, but how do we get access to data, right? We can't study what's happening online, we can't study cell phones or whatever. And then around 11 or so, people stopped asking that question because Twitter data became available, right? And that question just fell off, just disappeared entirely. But there's a way in which we sort of returned back to that moment. And I want to discuss that a little bit, but also discuss the trajectory of the field. I'm going to use political science as an example. But there's sort of been a rolling disaster for the field because of its reliance on Twitter/X. Obviously, there's a whole set of things that was really got a momentum in 2023, shutting down of Twitter's academic API, and then its APIs altogether, CrowdTangle. I mean, just this data access in in terms of the internet really has dramatically rolled back over the last few years. So today's story is looking at the question of whether the disappearance of Twitter as a resource is a disaster for the field. The answer is yes, but we weren't doing so good before, right? So that's the good news, is that really the status quo ante was pretty bad, and we just were fooling ourselves in terms of where we were. And I think, what's the answer? I'm going to give you one answer. I don't think it's the only answer. I think actually the answer involves maybe silver buckshot and not silver bullets. But I'm going to offer what I think is a significant component of the answer, which is the National Internet Observatory. And I'm going to give you some down payment of, I'm not allowing myself tons of time here, so I want to give 2 tiny peeks at research projects that we are doing just to show off what was possible, and then open up for discussion. I hope that this is something that is useful for some people in this room. So I don't have to convince you folks, but this is my standard slide here. Why do we need to develop a science of human behavior on the internet? It is useful just to revisit this. It's because so much of humanity takes place on the internet now. right? So that's thing one. It's just a place that human life takes place. And what happens there matters, right? But it's also that the internet is built for instrumenting human behavior. There are things that were happening before that we just couldn't capture, like, you know, the notion of someone reading the newspaper and like scanning halfway through a news story and flipping through. You know, there's no way to have easily studied that in mass 50 years ago. And yet it's almost trivial now, right, in terms of instrumenting. And so there's a way in which it's just a way to study human behavior that was happening before, but it's in a place where it can all be captured and recorded, is being captured and recorded. It's just mainly not for scientific purposes, it's for commercial purposes. So I'm going to give you a sense. I'm going to use political science as a case study, and actually just the top 3 journals in political science, because that was easy to hand code. But I actually think it's pretty representative of more broadly what's happened. And we're actually doing a much bigger literature assessment here, but I think it's sort of roughly consistent with what I'm showing. So I'm going to show you what the trends are in political science over time, what platforms were studied, of what elements of the online experience were being looked at. So here's the trend. Actually 23 is incomplete, but you know, 15 years ago there was essentially no research on the internet in the top political science journal, literally zero. In 2010, 2011, and then it sort of bounced between 0 and 1, but really it's gone up. And keep in mind, this is just 3 journals. So like, you know, let's say 10 papers appearing in just 3 journals in a year is actually not trivial. And if we so through 24, that line would certainly continue to go upward. So it is a significant resource being used by political science. I think probably still underutilized in certain important ways, but still it is a significant chunk of the data resources for social science right now. And so a question, is the disappearance of Twitter a disaster for the field? And the answer is very simple, yes. This is just hand coding that body of papers and where the data came from. And almost 80% of the data 80% of the papers were drawing on Twitter. This is should not be a shock to anyone in the room, but it is important. There was also a chunk coming from Facebook in various ways, but mainly it was Twitter, right? And so the disappearance of Twitter as a data resource, if it's 75% of your data resources, is clearly a disaster. Yes, there's an asterisk to that, which is it wasn't so great before, right? And I'll explain why. Has the research community been focused on the right things? And I say that as a member. I'm a card-carrying member, in some sense, almost, you know, one of the very first card-carrying members, right? And so, what has been studied in that literature? Again, looking at that body of work, it's almost all about production. What is being shared on Twitter? Because that's what the APIs made available. There is a non-trivial chunk on following, and that has to do with a distinctive element from political science. Literature is a great paper by Pablo Rivera that was based on following like 8 years, something like 7, 8 years ago, and there's a sort of bit of literature that followed up on that. But mainly production, almost nothing on consumption, right? And you know, so how does that match what people do on platforms? And this, ironically, I'm using a large-scale survey that I've been co-directing. And so we asked what platforms they use, how often they use them, and how often they post it, because posting is what was being studied. By the way, this is where people said they spend their time on social media. Part of the takeaway here is it's good to be Meta, because they control over half of the pie. This includes some IM platforms, in part because they're a blurry line between the big IM platforms and social media. But we can see Twitter is, you know, if I was at Thanksgiving and this was the slice of pie I was getting, I'd be a little disappointed, frankly, right? So it's not tiny, and I think actually, and I've certainly made this argument to reviewers, it was small, but it was very important in agenda setting and so on. And so I do think actually Twitter was a very worthwhile thing to study, but we can see, you know, it's dwarfed by Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and the like. Now, most people don't post much, right? So we ask people, how often do you post? You're on the platform, how often do you post? The modal category for most platforms is never. right? And then the median, even for instant messaging, is actually not that often, right? You know, it might be once a week. Like there are some people who are like all the time, and other people are just receiving content. And indeed, we have more sophisticated look at this, but if you look at poster is the very highest posting category, and lurker is everyone else. The most content comes from the very tiny number of posters, right? And they don't account for, unsurprisingly, most of the time on platform. And indeed, like when we've looked at behavioral data from Twitter, we might say 1% of accounts account for drive most of what you see on Twitter, and I don't think that's an atypical pattern. Probably less so on Facebook and more so on, say, TikTok. But the point here is mainly what happens on platforms is attention and consumption of information, and very little research studies that. Not zero, but very little. And so there's a way in which I'd say, if this screen represents everything that's happening on social media, what we as a field have largely focused our work on is that little white square, right? And we are going from that to this. That's much worse, right? But it really wasn't so good before, right? So have we been focused on the right things? Well, I'd say in defense of the field, we've been focusing on interesting things and worthwhile things. I love all my papers, but we've been all looking largely at a very small slice of what people do on social media and the internet more generally. And the weird thing is we talk about the attention economy, and I think that term is sort of right. Like what happens online is attention, and yet we've rarely measured attention. Not never, but rarely. So the answer has to be, and this is sort of a mea culpa of sorts, but like there's a reason for it? Not really, that we really haven't been focused on the right things. So what are alternative models for data? I have an even longer version of this talk where I go through each of these four, but which is, we could imagine leveraging bespoke data collections, collaborating with companies, encouraging data sharing by companies through policy. Not going to happen anytime soon. Well, in the US, in the EU is a different matter. Or build a shared infrastructure. We can go through the pros and cons of each of those. I'm going to focus on the fourth one because that's what I've been devoting my life to, right? And again, I don't think this is the whole solution, but I actually think it's a big chunk of the solution. So the National Internet Observatory. What is the National Internet Observatory? Well, this is based on a sizable National Science Foundation grant. It is, I'll give a shout out to my collaborators and co-PIs, Krista Wilson and Dave Chaffnes, who are computer scientists who do amazing work. Krista on various types of algorithm auditing, and Dave on Internet of Things in various ways. And it's really about volunteered source data collection with a shared infrastructure. I'm going to talk through the essential logic of it and give you a couple of case studies and then open up for discussion. So the project objective is to collect data from a large number of consented participants. So thousands of people. We had aspirations for it to be tens of thousands, but not right now. Thousands of participants. We capture various data from participants, seeing what they see, and then we can capture some elements of the algorithmic curation. So you search for something on Google, we can see what you search for, we can see what you're shown, and then we can see what you click on. Like that's just sort of an example case, but we can in principle do that across many platforms, and then provide analytic access to the broader research community in a ethical, privacy-preserving fashion. I'll note every layer of this is hard and painful. And I knew that to begin with, and it's harder and more painful than I imagined. So, but doable, right? And a lot of it is do it and then do it better, right? It is an iterative process of figuring out how to improve. So, the exciting concerns. And then one concerning exciting aspects and one sort of potentially key. I mean, there are a number of concerning elements, but the nice thing is that we will be getting this. We will see what people share. Like if you tweet something, we'll see what you have tweeted. But we'll get to see exposure and consumption and what you're shown and what you click on and so on. It'll be cross-platform, so we'll be able to see what you do across many platforms. most research has been single platform. And so it's great to understand holistically what's happening. We are linking it with survey data. So a lot of behavioral work is like, well, we looked at a lot of tweets. They may be from people, they may be from humans, and so on. And like that drives me insane sometimes as social scientists. And like we have like companies and politicians and regular people and corporations and bots. And so we all know these are sort of regular people. I mean, I'll put quotes around regular because that's part of the caveat here. It'll be by and for academic research, and not relying on corporate provision of data, and the control and the strings will often come with that. And it's with ethically informed and genuine concern around informed consent. And the question, and this is something we are wrestling with, in the biggest single question, there are multiple concerns here, is around validation. And just who the heck agrees to let researchers put software that looks over their shoulder all the time? I mean, especially with our consent, they really, really understand. This isn't like here's a 13-page document. When we consent people, we say, sure, you can look at the 13-page document. We're going to give you a plain English explanation here, and then we're going to quiz you on it to make sure you really understand what you're consenting to, right? And so there's that question, and we're working on this issue of like how weird are the people that we are studying. We can see one thing is that they're really into answering surveys. So there's like this whole ecosystem online. We can see all of that happening. We can actually see projects that researchers are running on YouGov, where the subjects are running between YouGov and LLMs, right? And which is fascinating and concerning. So our approach is, I'm going to. The black elements are sort of the infrastructure, and the red are sort of ethical interventions. We have our participants who send data to a data warehouse from both desktop and mobile devices. There's a lot of cleaning that happens on people's devices because we want to remove some of the sensitive stuff, and also just not collect a lot of stuff. And that goes to a data warehouse where it's then further cleaned. It then goes to a distributed analysis cluster, which then can be remotely accessed via VMs by researchers. And the kinds of ethical interventions we have here is a robust consent process where, like that I just referred to, we have it processed before it goes from the data warehouse to distributed analysis cluster. We give researchers access just to the data that they need, so you have to make a case. You don't just get a ticket to everything. You have to say, here are the various data products, here are the data products we need, and here's the research plan. This is really why I need access to these data. So we're trying to limit the potential exposure. And then we have, unsurprisingly, technical barriers to data extraction. There's a data use agreement, which institutions have to sign, but then also ethics training that researchers have to do, because, IRB processes, the standard human subject stuff does not really cover the ethical conundrums in these data. So we had to invent our own ethics process, our own review of applications process, and then we have sort of various kinds of monitoring of what researchers are doing in and out, just so that we can spot check that everything's okay. So there's all these controls, and I'm sure we will iterate and improve them as we go. But just so you know that, and for those of you who may be researchers down the line, you'll find some of them annoying, frankly, and that's just life, because they do create speed bumps, they do create bureaucracy, and there's just no way around that. And so the data collected is pretty substantial, right? Obviously, we have the survey data, and we collected all these sort of standard kinds of things, from behavioral data on desktop. Obviously, we get browsing activity of various kinds. So we have HTML snapshots that are then parsed. So we have this set of platforms, internet-based platforms that we're collecting data from almost all the big ones. Or the one big one that we are unable to do right now is Instagram, because they detect that we are we are scraping. We don't know how the heck they're doing that. There's a single platform that get our users in trouble, and so we aren't yet collecting data. If any of you have thoughts on how they're doing that, that would be, approach me quietly, not on recording later. Speaking of privacy issues, and cookies and so on. And then on mobile, mobile is its own annoying ecosystem to collect data from, but we are, getting stuff on what apps are being used, time in foreground. There's some things from within apps that we can collect. I won't go into right now. We can see traffic to and from apps. We have some visibility within some apps of content. We are not doing, I know people here are familiar with the screenshot approach. At the moment, we're not doing screenshots, and there are pros and cons to that, but it's just not, it would create a serious, there are serious issues there, both on the engineering side, on the ethics side, that we decide right now we have enough on our to-do list. So. And right now, our sample size, our maximum sample size, we surged through the election because that seemed like an interesting time, although it continues to be interesting. And it's multi-device based, as I mentioned. We had 1,000 for much of last year because we were just trying to work out issues. And then we surged through the election. We peaked at 7,000, and we've been sort of ebbing since. So we have probably, several thousand people. I have some graph somewhere, which I don't have readily available, showing you the decay function if you're interested in our retention of subjects. I'm also happy to talk much more about recruitment issues and so on. All this is coupled with demographics. And what we have is sort of people across three, it's annoying as hell, because we have people across three kinds of data systems. So the biggest one that we've collected, we started with extension first, and then Android, because there was more work in collecting Android. I have to thank Kieran, by the way, for working with us. It's a community thing, so I don't to build some of this. We're not trying to just start from scratch, and so we have, like, say a few. I have to double check, but say a few thousand on Android. Much more of that on extension based, and then iOS has been a really tough nut to crack. And they have these rules about required deletion of any data you collect, and they have rules that they don't tell you, so you have to then have it rejected. And so they said, well, you can't retain the data. All right, we found a consent from a project that said, well, we'll retain the data for 20 years. We're like, all right, that's what we'll put as our policy, 20 years. And then they're like, oh yeah, no, you can't do 20 years. We're like, well, what's the rule? I'm like, well, could you do it for 5 or 10? We're like, well, those are two different numbers. Like, what are your rules? And they're like, well, it really has to be no more than 10. We're like, well, but that doesn't make us happy, but we'll agree to delete the data in 10 years. Right? But like the fact that they didn't even have that policy written down, and this has been the case, like every single one of these stores, and this is a problem, is that we're relying on the extension store, we're relying on the Google Play, we're relying on iOS for distribution. We've managed to overcome that, but like these are not researcher friendly platforms. And it's not surprising, it's not in their interest. But they haven't strategically decided. I think this is not like strategic decision, like we're gonna make it hard for them. I think they just make it hard accidentally. So yay for that. So what's the researcher application process flowchart? So this is not exactly, some of this would move in parallel, but if you're a researcher, there would be a few hours of ethics training that talks about the sensitivity of the data and the specific issues around NEO data. There's a code of conduct that you as researchers have to sign off on. There's an intake form where you have to basically say what your project is and talk about the risks and mitigation measures. Then we have to approve that form. Again, we haven't come across any projects that we haven't approved, but there has been sort of some back and forth on things like mitigation. And then there's a legal data use agreement that your institution signs on. By the way, for those of you who pursue this, that should be step one, because lawyers take a while. So just FYI, maybe Princeton lawyers are faster. No, so
they're a little busy right now.
Yes, well, yeah, fair enough. I'll cut all university lawyers some slack right now. But in any case, I would get that going first while you're going through everything else. I'm going to give you 2 research case studies, and then I'm going to open up well, you can open questions anytime, but case study one is like a replication of a paper a number of us had, this research team had in Nature a few years ago, looking at Google, what Google showed about Democrats versus Republicans, and the second is looking at the selfishness of LLMs. I'll explain by which I mean the external referral rates of chatbots, LLM chatbots versus other kinds of platforms. And these are meant to sort of simple descriptive results, but give just a little bit of a flavor of what's possible. So this is the paper we're replicating. This was just also as a case study. This was an incredibly expensive paper to produce because it involved instrumenting samples in 2018 and 2020 to collect a lot of data about what they were doing, not just what I'm showing you, but a lot more data. We have a lot more data from 2018 and 2020, small samples though, hundreds of people, because it was expensive to get people to participate, but large enough to do something with, in the hundreds of people, right? And so this paper cost literally hundreds of thousands of dollars when you properly cost it out, because it was an expensive bespoke data collection. And by the time we were done with it, it had taken years, the platforms had changed, and then all the other data we collected were like, well, it's old.
I just want to highlight one thing for people in the room, like that is expensive for this field. That's like totally normal cost for a paper in a top tier publication in like development economics and some other areas. Like a couple $100K if you tell me you're doing like a large scale RCT for that, it's like incredibly cheap. So there is like a sense in which this field, despite its importance for human behavior, is like radically underfunded.
Yeah, no, that is true. And the thing is, we can do this paper now vastly cheaper. So I'm going to show you a replication we did, and it cut the cost by like 99% essentially. I mean, it still required some labor to rewrite the scripts for the structure of the data, right? And so there was not zero, but like a 99% reduction in cost is pretty impressive. Plus an order of magnitude more data, actually orders of magnitude more data. What I'm going to show you is like from a number of months ago, so before we had our big data surge. And this is just, again, this is the long abstract. The bold is what I'll show you the replications of. We found basically that Google showed slightly different things to Democrats and Republicans, and that's probably largely driven by the search queries. But then Democrats and Republicans picked substantially different stuff. Like you give people, Democrats and Republicans the same list, they're going to pick different things. And so it's not primarily about what they're being shown, it's what they choose given what they're shown. And so that's and it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that, but that's the sort of essential takeaway. And then we also had these results on being shown unreliable content on news sites that I'm going to show you. The basic thing that we did in the original paper was we looked at, Google search exposure, what Google showed you to, Google search follows, that's what you clicked on, and then we looked at overall engagement, which is your browsing patterns of what you looked at, right? I won't go into the caveats right now, but this is sort of a sense of the data share. We had the 2018 data, and we had 300-ish participants, in the sort of 250 to 300-ish range. We had somewhat more than that in the 2020 data collection. Very quirky samples in their ways. And then here we had more than 1,000. Yes.
Why did that cost several $100,000 if it's 300?
Well, first of all, there's the engineering for the development costs. So then second of all, we, for the first one, we did a $70,000, the survey cost $70,000. It should have probably cost somewhat less, and there's a longer story why it cost as much as it did, but if we had done it right, it probably would have cost $50,000. But we learned stuff around dealing with funders and survey companies and so on. There was like just a complex negotiation which did not make it efficient. But there was a ton of labor involved. There was subject costs. There was labor before, there was labor after, because these are messy data. So there was the engineering and the data collection, there was engineering data-wise after, and then there was the costs of subject recruitment. And then of course the 2020, similarly with 2020, we also had equivalent subject costs. So it's just it was very expensive as a bespoke project to recruit people. And so we had an order of magnitude more data in the replication I'm going to show you, and now we have an order of magnitude more, like it's in the sort of depending 1,000 to 2,000 range, but we probably have more like 6,000 or 7,000 if we use the data we have available yesterday. So and here's the figures from the original paper, and this is sort of looking at on the top line here. Let me see, this is showing up when I do this right. Oh, slower. But this top over here, on top is showing the average partisanship of content shown to Democrats or Republicans. And so the red dot is a little to the right of the blue dot. That means that what Republicans are being shown as by an audience, I won't go into our measures, but there are sort of these partisan measures of domains, that the stuff being shown Republicans is a bit more to the right of what's being shown to Democrats. Not a huge gap. And then when we look at what people click on, which is the next level down, there's a substantially bigger gap. And then interestingly, in terms of overall engagement, there's an even bigger gap. And then we can look at that replicates in 18 and 20, and then we look at unreliable news, and we see that the average rate that Google shows people unreliable news is actually pretty low if you look at proportion of reliable news, but it shows more to Republicans than to Democrats, and then there's more engagement among Republicans. And then if we look at the NEO data, it actually is remarkably close, even down to the point estimates to what we had in 18 and 20. So this seems to be a pretty robust pattern across 6-7 years, which in internet time is a really long time. And another finding that we looked at was how concentrated exposure is to unreliable news. We found generally it's very concentrated, but especially when we look at follows and engagement, it's the being exposed is less concentrated. This is 2018 and 2020, and we had a very similar graph in 2020. So our major findings are actually replicated remarkably cleanly in this. But what's neat is that we can then look at other platforms where you can see what's being shown, like Facebook, and say, look, and generate similar figures. And so like here, this is for a longer period. We can look at the results that I just showed you from Google search, and then how polarized content is from Facebook, which is much more polarized for Facebook than it is for search in terms of follows. And this is looking at the union of participants. So this is looking at everyone. But the other neat thing is you can do within subjects analysis, because there are some people who never, who don't show up in the Facebook or don't show up in Google data in terms of getting news content. And so, and there we got similar results, although actually somewhat less polarized on Facebook, which tells us there are sort of some subset people who probably just get news from Facebook, and they're extremely polarized, and we haven't. And this isn't like a deep dive on a research finding, but just the point here is to show you that you can do comparison across platforms pretty easily. This is sort of neat to be able to compare Facebook and Google for same people, different people, and so on. And then we can again look at the same stuff with unreliable content. We see that Facebook, there's a lot more following of unreliable content than there is on Google. Not shocking, actually, when you think about the logic of the two platforms, and that there's also the similar partisan difference. But it is reassuringly sensible in a way, if given the literature. And this is sort of the within subjects comparison. Selfishness of LLMs, and here again just a very brief look, and then I'll be quiet. One of the interesting things that's going on, one of the things all platforms on the internet have to wrestle with is how much to point you away, right? Because there's in a way the logic of the World Wide Web going back a quarter of a century or more ago is, oh, you can hyperlink and you can take people to a completely different website. But then if you're a Facebook or some other platform, you're like, Why would we do that? We want to keep people here because we can monetize their attention. And one of the interesting things, actually, on another research project, but I think this is also broadly known, is that the amount that Facebook has referred people off of platform has plummeted by an order of magnitude over the last 5 years. You can look at the Facebook URLs data, people are familiar with that, and you can just sort of see that the URL amounts that you see have dropped like 90% in just 2 years, from like 2020 to 2022, and then Facebook shut the product down. So we don't see what happens after that. Again, this gets to some of the pros and cons of corporate reliance and relying on companies for data when the data may show something inconvenient. And then similarly, Twitter, if you look at Twitter and how much, let's say, the New York Times has a lot of followers on Twitter. And let's say 3 years ago, when the New York Times shared a story, you would see tens of thousands of reshares with that hyperlink. And now if you look at the New York Times handle and you look at them sharing, it will be tens of times. So it's essentially disappeared as a referring source for news content. It's not just the New York Times, it's Fox News, so it's right and left. It's just that X has decided we are not referring people off a platform. This has been stated policy. It's true. There's proof. I'm not. I mean, believe me, because I don't have like epistemologically compelling. But you can go look at it, and it's really quite startling. So we can do this comparison. If we call that selfishness, like how much you try to keep customers. And again, this is a very crude measure, and before we publish it, we'll come up with a better version, but we can look at how much you use each platform, and for each day that you use it, how much are you referred, you click and go off of that. And here we have some social media, LLMs, Google and Bing, and let me actually just go here. The y-axis is the external referral rate. Google and Bing, even though I think they are becoming more selfish, but we don't have the overtime data there, because as they become AI, they're just, obviously that's their business model. They're the gateway to the open web. I think that's changing. They are now summarizing the open web. But then Facebook, Reddit, Twitter has very low, and then the LLMs people barely ever click on the external links. They're provided. It's just that they're like sort of buried. And so, as we see, like what we're seeing now with Google and Bing, and we'll hopefully be able to study this over time, is that they are becoming increasingly chatbot level, right? That they're offering AI-based summaries. And so, an interesting question is, do we see these domains do those lines sort of shrink? But this, again, the point here is not to like prove this right now. This is a very preliminary finding, so don't write home about this. How
is the referral rate calculated?
It's just looking at did you visit in a given day, and using that as a denominator. It's not necessarily the best denominator, and so that's one of the things we're wrestling with. How do you come up with an apples to apples comparison, which is part of why I would say consume this with caution. But I would wager that qualitatively, that no matter how you calculate the denominator, this is the takeaway, that you're going to get the LLM products at one extreme and the current iteration of search engines at the other. We probably have seen, if we could go back in time, we can't, we probably would have seen like Facebook referring a lot more people, let's say 4 years ago, and a lot less now. But this is like this notion of capturing the how selfish or selfless platforms. It seems like a good thing to think about, because it also then has implications, like I've talked about to people in the media, and they're like, yeah, you don't get anything from, when we use Twitter now, we get nothing, right? When I post things on Facebook, our organization posts things on Facebook, we get nothing. And it's like, yeah, that's a matter of corporate strategy. And the side effect is that it's harming outlets that were depending on that traffic. So I won't go into this is the overall pattern here, but this is sort of a summary of what I just told you. So now let's chat. Like the objective really of those was just like two little dumplings to get a little taste of what we're up to. But You know, we're gradually opening for business. We'll probably in a number of months. I'm not going to give you an exact number. Open with an open call for external researchers. We're gathering names, so if you click that, you can add your name and email to the list. You know, what questions you have about NEO, you know, and yeah, how might it be useful to you? So you can. Yes.
I had a question about the initial part that you talked about, the political science analysis. You said that 80% of the papers used Twitter data.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just curious, how come not Reddit? And especially since Twitter has been shut down, Reddit access has still been okay, even though the API has kind of
It's a little
become
shaky.
private,
Yeah.
but there's still access to that data.
They killed push it though, right?
What's that?
They killed push it.
Yes.
Right, but I think there's still like academic torrents and there's ways to get that comprehensive data. So I was just curious, in political science, like, is that a domain specific decision, and like why was it like Twitter, and obviously shutting down was a bad deal, but like why did it not pivot to like some other platform?
I'll give you my guess, but I know that's not answered. You know, papers you know, don't give a clue why the researchers didn't use other resources usually. But like, I think that Twitter data has a neater structure, and of course you build it also you know, has this nice, it fits more neatly within political science paradigms in various kinds of ways, because you have these individual level data, which political, even though there's a lot of network elements, ironically, there's not been a tremendous amount of work on although except for the Fowler stuff, and even the Fowler stuff really wasn't very networky. So it fits very neatly into existing data paradigms, and the API made it, you know, pretty neat. I mean, was even used in undergrad data science classes as little projects, right? That was a thing. Yes, we have evidence here that was the case, and so it was much easier to deal with on the downstream level, and then a community was built around it. So like, these aren't solitary decisions. These are like, what are other people doing? You know, what other code could I borrow, and so on. So I think there are multiple reasons why Twitter, and it's not just political science, but there are multiple reasons why Twitter was more popular. And yeah, one could debate which is more important, but in any case, I think there are multiple reasons why Twitter was more popular than Reddit.
In terms of the observatory itself, can you share how you actually collect some of this data and the role that the platform plays in it? I ask this because there's different ways to collect this data. One way that we used to collect was running ads, so that we are interested in social media data. The platform has a big role there, right? So like, for example, they shut down my advertising account and you can't run ads, and so you don't get that data anymore.
So you're talking about the role that platforms play in recruiting subjects versus?
In terms of your own like platform that you built with the observatory, like, can they like shut it down? Are you scraping?
So we're taking HTML snapshots and then parsing them in various ways. So it's pretty straightforward in a way. Now, of course, the parsing is not at all straightforward, and of course these companies take a lot of evasive action. So it's hard. You know, and certainly some companies have shown a willingness to be aggressive in attacking researchers' data collection. They have not done it yet. Maybe they'll see this video and, you know, they'll shut us down. So we're not. So yeah, it's not. We're not dependent on platforms except to the extent that they could, you know, kill us with a pinky. So, you know, we're dependent that they don't kill us. And like I said, in some sense, Instagram is a case study of like one countermeasure that they've just taken very broadly. It's not aimed at us, it's just we would want, specifically, it is aimed at us in the sense that it's not personal, it's just, it's business. But it's the business they're in. Because I think they've just anticipated that scraping possibility. So, yes.
Can you give us a sense of sort of the participant issue, right? About how relatively representative is it?
Yeah. So I've hit some slides here and here, but I can tell you some of the biases that we have in the data, and this is based on the survey data. We are biased towards more highly educated people, towards more liberals, and fewer conservatives, especially, fewer conservatives. We are biased younger. Now, we do have significant subsamples of all of the underrepresented samples, but there's a question, of course, if we are biased in ways that are unobserved, right? And then we're also biased in certain kinds of online behaviors we can see, because there is a professional survey class, and we provide incentives to participate. And I should note, we've had to build a whole fraud machinery around this, and I've developed way more expertise in fraud than I like. But we can, as I mentioned earlier, we can see that these are people who are many of them are multiple survey companies. We're trying to develop a metric of how survey oriented they are, so that way researchers downstream can say, here are my super professional survey takers versus less so. We can see we overrepresent Bing users. And the reason for that is that Bing incentivizes people to use Bing. You get points, if you respond to this incentive, you respond to that incentive. And so we still have mostly Google users, but Bing is way more than it should be. So we can see that there are these kinds of biases, both demographic and behavioral. And we're then trying to evaluate, trying our best to evaluate the data against certain kinds of benchmarks. Some of them are survey-based, like ANES has internet use stuff that we calibrated to. We had those items in our fall survey, so we can calibrate the survey behavior questions against theirs against ours, and that has been the gold standard, maybe now silver standard, probability sample. So if we can compare it to that, that's good. Although ironically, they have some similar biases that we do. And of course, unfortunately, I don't know if we'll ever see an ANES again after this year. But at least we have 2024. So sorry, in the back, and then that.
I guess for commercial survey, commercial equivalents of your data, they stop one step before. They don't actually parse the HTML that you're consuming.
That's right.
How have you thought about this process of both deciding on what to keep, but also kind of thinking on an evolving panel, what should be the procedure for new things to be incorporated into the parsing pipeline? Because I can imagine this is not a static thing that you will decide, okay, these are the things that we want to parse. This will depend a lot on the interest on the researchers, but also on the state of the web as is.
Yeah, and we're trying to consult we have an advisory board, and we're trying to consult, and right now it's sort of we're trying for the biggest ones, and we've certainly also, as people apply or researchers get interest, we're clearly the LLM products are the early people who have talked to us are really interested in ChatGPT. It's not surprising. So we are trying to work with the research community, and ultimately in the longer run, we need some type of collective governance model where we sort of do. We have an advisory committee, but we're not making it authoritative. We're getting advice, and then we're trying to deal with the practicality. It's also a cost benefit thing. Yes, of course you'd like us to do that, but that's going to take 6 months of engineering, and then it will break in a day. And that's there are these cost benefit analyses, and we have to think what's beneficial for the research community, how much it costs to build that, and then also then how much it costs to maintain it, because we have to build this whole cycle of build and maintain, and every product we build has to be maintained, and we're now learning the downstream costs of maintenance, which is not fun. And we don't. It's not even clear how much something costs to maintain, because a lot of that depends on the countermeasures. Like Facebook literally changes some of the structure of their HTML like every day kind of thing. And so a lot of, now there are ways we have of getting around that, but like some of these companies are very evasive to make it very, very expensive to what we're doing. And so so it has to be a collective decision about taking into account the costs, and that's the longer run. We have a process to help get a sense of what the community wants, and we have a multidisciplinary advisory board that's made up of a variety of types of people. And if you and we talk to people. If you have advice about what you'd really like, you know, talk to us, because we are trying to learn about what people are interested in, and try to. That's not just sort of, you know, obviously I know people like me, and I'm trying to stay away from that kind of bias and making sure that we have a very multidisciplinary group that is advising us. So that's how we're trying to deal with it, noting it's all like building the plane while we're flying it. So
this is incredibly impressive and generous, so thank you for that. I have many questions about these engineering headaches, but I'm going to ask a more scientific question. So I thought your description of the prior state of the field was very interesting about how the affordances of the tools shape the kind of research that happened.
Yeah.
Then your two examples of research, so I'm wondering, like, what are the affordances of the new thing, and how is that going to shape research? And I thought it was interesting that some was more focused on users and some was more focused on platforms.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that is the kind of main dimensions you're thinking about, or how do you see the kind of spotlight you're building?
yeah, that's a really good question. You know, in the ideal world, we are really seeing what people see, right? That is the central affordance, and what that means is we're not going to be a stronger tool for seeing what is shared, and the reason for that is that if most content comes from 1% of users, right?
Yeah.
Then in our 6,000 people, we have 60 users, right? And that's not a useful sample. And so, and you know, that's just the nature of, like, I mean, 6,000 historically by social science standards is a pretty big sample. But the reality is that a lot of social sciences have certainly political sciences, focused on behaviors that a lot of people engage in, like voting. Or do you have preferences for things, and so on. You know, when you get to things like money and politics, most money, I remember once we had a project years ago on looking at FEC data, and even the FEC data, we figured that that most money in politics came from a few hundred people, and that's actually less concentrated than it is now. And so if you want to study money in politics and you care about where the median dollar comes from, it really gets down to like 10 or 20 people. And if a random sample doesn't do it, right? Or even like a weird sample, unless you somehow like say, let me just get billionaires. So we clearly, I think we have something that's pretty good for studying exposure and the mechanisms of exposure, and not nearly as good. Still has some value for sharing behavior, but like, because a lot of people occasionally share on some platform, probably a lot of people do. But if you're trying to understand that at the content level, then this isn't so great. Like Twitter, for example, would have been way better, because you could see so much content and get such a big sample. We just don't have that anymore. So that's, I think, the key distinction. And it's like it's very different set of affordances. And if it succeeds, it will, you know, partly purposely and partly incidentally. It's not like I'm saying studying content is a bad thing. I think that's a great thing. It's just that this is a tool for really studying the mechanisms of exposure.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just see Instagram, back to that. You can't see Instagram, but you can see Facebook.
Instagram.
No, I know, but you cannot see Instagram, but you can see Facebook.
Yes.
Okay, and no clarification as to why that is?
I've not asked Meta. So.
So
I mean, it tells us something interesting about the corporate structure at Meta. That practice hasn't diffused. And maybe, again, like I said, this is the risk of going online and talking about these things. So, you know, hopefully no one will, you know, if I find tomorrow that Meta is now, that Facebook has shifted, then I'll be very sad. So, no one say anything. You know, those of you online, so. Yes.
So can you see what people are exposed to online? What kind of information do you have, you know, offline information about them? Is there any possibilities of leaking this to any offline behaviors or anything like this?
Well, anything that's survey accessible, you know, we do ask surveys. We do provide both the demographics, but then we could do spot surveys. So, and some of our model will be if people have extra grants, like I have a collaborator where we're studying mental health and internet usage. And what we're doing is we're doing a standard depression battery every 2 weeks, and we can do within subjects evaluation of internet exposure and behaviors and depression. And so like but you could ask a lot of other things. We also get some location data from mobile devices, which in itself could be a very interesting thing if we're trying to understand patterns of mobility. So we tried to come up. This is another thing about the collective governance of thinking about like what are the survey questions we should be asking and so on. And then, like I said, there could be add-ons. There could even be experiments. That would be another collective governance thing. Like you could certainly imagine. Let's do a deactivation experiment. Of course, that really screws with the value of the sample in some ways. And so there's but putting that aside, if someone said, "Here's $1 million grant." Assuming, sort of like the old Steve Martin, like, how do you become rich? Well, first assume $1 million, and then I can tell you how to get rich. And so if someone came with a large grant and said, we'll help you recruit people, and then some of them will ask to deactivate TikTok and see what happens, because there'll be some interesting substitution effects and so on. Of course, there is this venue of deactivation experiments that has been pretty exciting in terms of understanding things, and that would be great. This is actually a great complement to that kind of experiment because you could then do pre-post, and there's all the stuff you could do. It would be cheap, but grant funding is plentiful nowadays. So.
Thank you.
Going back to where I started today.
So on that happy note, please join me in thanking David for joining us today.